Just to start off, just to give a little bit of background on me and who I am and what's going on in sort of the world of payments and Worldpay. I'm responsible for what we call strategic products, innovation, experience, and standards at Worldpay. And I've been doing that for 6-8 months, something like that. Previously, I was the CIO for the e-commerce business, which is essentially what it is. I was responsible for technology and tech delivery, product delivery for the e-com team, which supports merchants like that's not my slides. Merchants like Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon and Google, but also smaller merchants that you may or may not have heard of. Lots of folks in the UK space in specific verticals. Thames Water, for example, is a merchant of ours. Scottish Power. Some of the gambling merchants, Bet365, and some of those merchants. So lots of different merchants across a pretty broad set of verticals. I've been at Worldpay for about 3.5, almost 4 years. Before that, I was responsible for product strategy and product management at Chase Payment Tech, was there for 2.5, 3 years or so, and had a lot of fun with customers and learning lots of great stuff. I spent probably more time than I care to admit on Apple Pay. That was a great 2.5 years of my life. If you have any questions about that, we can talk about that. But so enough of that. Let's talk about. We'll talk about a little bit more about me. Oh, the reason I have this up here to talk about my quote unquote origin story, my digital origin story, is to on the surface we're going to talk about payments innovation, but just below that and kind of a little bit deeper, I want to talk about what's led me to kind of the path around digital innovation, payments innovation, sort of my career choices and things like that, and some of the things that kind of really influence the way that I approach building products and services for customers. So, I guess the easiest way to kind of start around this is that my father and I revolutionized police work in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, and we'll never get credit for it. And that's okay with me. And that's kind of how I got started in technology. So I was just a kid. My dad was a police officer. He was working in legislative analysis and sort of traffic stuff. He wrote a bunch of laws for traffic in California and Los Angeles. And back in the olden days, police officers actually filled out reports by hand. And there's a very specific way to fill out these reports. And you had to use block letters and on certain paper and certain line formats and all of that, and it was all by hand. Everybody in the office realized that this was a tremendous waste of time because writing things by hand meant that you could make mistakes, and there was like gallon-sized buckets of whiteout. Does anybody even remember what whiteout is? Right. In the offices, and they would white stuff out, and then they would write back over it, not even using a typewriter, which is sort of typical of kind of law enforcement technology. They were a late adopter for a long time until quite recently. And to kind of fast forward, they started to they bought a computer system in their office, and this will really date. I remember I was a little kid. I was very little. They had these Mohawk data systems, and they ran CPM. So anybody even remember what CPM is, right? Yeah, I know, a couple people, right? Anyways, these systems, they were meant to make the problems of filling out reports easier, faster, simpler for the police officers. But what they didn't do was actually make their lives easier, right? They didn't achieve the outcome that that they wanted. I just remember going in and playing like Othello or like really text. It was all terminal user interface, TUI, not even GUI. And you know, playing Othello or like Minesweeper or something like that, when you know, these games, because that's about what these systems could do. And you know, there was no IT department, there wasn't, you know, central, you know, kind of anything like that. And so what my dad ended up doing was bringing in a computer that we built at home and started doing those sorts of things. And one computer turned into two to four, 4 to 8. And pretty soon we had built computers for the entire office and computerized his whole team and this division. And then pretty soon across the street there was a lieutenant that found out that these guys were using computers and so on and so forth. And eventually, you know, it became really critical for police officers working desk work that they had to have a computer. And that's kind of the beginning of my origin story. Now, the lesson to learn here isn't, you know, that I was a little kid and played around with, you know, Los Angeles Police Department assets and was allowed to sort of monkey around in you know, offices with a bunch of cops. But the lesson here is that the problem that they were trying to solve, which is, you know, efficient delivery of service, was not achieved by the technology that was deployed. And so it was a lesson that I learned really early on. And I want you to think about that as I talk about payments and payment innovation, because we're in a situation right now where there's a lot of technology being thrown at the wall around payments and tech and you know, fintech and all of that. But those solutions that get thrown at the wall, the ones that actually solve problems are the ones that are going to work. And the ones that are just tech for tech's sake, those are the ones that, you know, will sort of fall by the wayside. So last thing I want to say about this is the technology is inevitable. It's just always going to be there, right? Alan talked about passwords, usernames and passwords. Do you know the Romans invented passwords, right? You know, over 2,000 years ago. And we're still using them today. Not great, right? Not great. We talked about pins earlier. Pins are just a really lame version of a password. And, you know, we're still using those. But the technology is changing those sorts of things. It will happen. But it still doesn't change the fact that you need to authenticate a user. You know, when I shop on Amazon, it doesn't change the fact that me as a consumer still wants to get my, you know, whatever. I think my wife ordered a food bin for the dog. You know, you know, whether it's this year or 10 years ago, I still need a food bin for the dog so that the mice don't eat the food, right? But the technology has changed the interaction, the channel, the availability, the scope, the scale, but it didn't actually change the consumer desires. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So some of the themes that I will talk about today, and you can read those at your leisure, but a couple of big ones that you want to kind of want to, you know, think about: transparency. We'll talk about translucence, translucent payments, identity. Identity, plug for David Birch. If any of you know David Birch, Identity is the New Money. It's a great book. It's about this thin, so you can read it in 30 minutes. He should pay me, because I always plug his book. And we'll start with what's old is new again. So, like, how many of you have shopped on Amazon today? Yeah, okay. See? That's right, you just got some. How many, you like, who has, is Amazon Now in the New York? Does Amazon Now work in New York? No, anybody? It does, yeah. So when I first moved to London, Amazon Now had just launched in London, and I lived in Covent Garden, and it was like, wow, I could get everything I want in less than 2 hours. This is great. And so, you know, the technology enabled the rapid delivery of goods and services, but it actually didn't change my desire to want to get my stuff. I ordered a printer one day when my wife was there with the kids and was visiting before they'd moved over, and we needed to print something, and I didn't have a printer, and she said, well, where are we going to print it? I said, that's okay, I'll just order a printer, and it just showed up magically. It was great. Didn't change, didn't change anything, my desires or wants or needs or anything. What the technology did change was the fact that I could get a printer in a couple of hours and be able to print quite rapidly. But I want to talk about Sears and Roebuck because if you want to learn what's happening in e-commerce, what Amazon is doing or what other folks are doing, all you have to do is look to the past. Sears and Roebuck, does anybody even know what, like who shops at Sears? Has anybody shopped at Sears in the last year? One person there, two people?
Shopped at Sears for years.
Well, of course, for years, of course. But like recently, that's why they declared bankruptcy, right? And if you look at Sears and Roebuck, the history of Sears and Roebuck is quite interesting. They started out, much smaller than what they became, and this is how they started, right? In the catalog business. Catalog was a relatively small segment of the market in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they basically created this market and ballooned it to what it was by the 1950s. And that started their retail empire. So all you have to do is think about what Amazon is doing today. What did they do? They started with books. Right? Does anybody remember that when they were selling just books? Right? And books actually were cheaper than what you could buy at Barnes & Noble or whatever. And now they're the same price anyways. Used to be books, on Amazon were half the price, but they're not half the price anymore. Amazon is doing the same thing that Sears and Roebuck did 50, 100 years ago. They're increasing the number of channels. They've created a marketplace. And they're going into face-to-face retail. So, future of e-commerce, you can look to the past and see some of those things happen over and over again. And so the trick now is to look at the patterns of the past and see, what's going to be next, what's going to happen next. And we can also look to the past. This is from the British Museum. The British Museum has a great hallway of the history of money. And I was just there the other day. But I've had this picture in my slides for a long time. Up there on the top left is a little metal card, and this is from John Brown, which is a retailer in Chicago. And you used to register, and they would build these little metal plates, and then you would come into the shop and you say, "Well, I'm Mark," and they would go grab the metal plate from the back, and then they would stick it on the thing, and they would use carbon to slide the invoice, and then you'd pay it at some future time. So it was quite interesting how that, sort of these metal plate advanced to the plastic cards to chip cards to, mobile phones and so on and so forth. But there's something really interesting about that metal plate over there. There was an authentication step that happened that was sort of different, but also similar to what we do today. That metal plate also had a authentication step where I walked in and I say, "I'm Mark." If the clerk didn't know who I was, then I didn't get my stuff. And so there was a personal identity mechanism where the clerk and the shopper had a relationship of some sort, and that's how the interaction was authenticated. And now what do we have? We have usernames and passwords and emails and 3D secure and all these sort of different technologies to validate that interaction, or a PIN when we put our card in, or physical possession of the card itself, and that's the authentication step. But how do we pay today? You can look at that. We went from plastic cards to now all of these sorts of things, to more and to even more, right? There's literally hundreds. Worldpay supports over 300 different pay types today, all of them online, and that's an awful lot. Across multiple geographies, across multiple currencies. And we're not the only ones that do that, right? All of the big players support just dozens and dozens of different pay types. And so we went from this relatively simple, scenario, little metal pieces of, plastics and metals and that, and cash, to literally dozens, hundreds of different pay types across the globe. And so we've got, a set of diversity, a kind of a really diverse set capabilities that consumers as well as merchants want to be able to use. But thinking about what merchants actually want, right? That technology that's out there it's not changing what the merchant wants. The merchant wants to sell more stuff. They want to reduce their risk and they reduce their costs. And that's how every seller operates today. And their big desires can always be traced back to this. And so, as part of that exercise to know your customer, know what outcomes you want to drive and deliver, always think about these things. So I'm going to transition to talk a little bit about security and identity in a second here, but that's because of this little troublemaker on the bottom here. Do you see this? He's swiping his Apple right there. As part of reducing risks here, what could the shopkeeper have done? He could have put up a stronger door or something like that. Could have done lots of different things. In the current payments ecosystem online, I think relatively, not completely, but relatively, payments are relatively safe. Consumers generally get what they want. Merchants generally are able to sell what they want. The risk factors that are in the industry are they're not small, but they're not so large that we've put a complete stop to selling things on the internet. In some markets, regulations have passed to encourage further authentication, further identity checks, assurance that will make sure that that little guy down in the corner was not stealing your stuff. But at the same time, we have markets that are generally safe today. But being generally safe doesn't mean that you're completely safe, and there's still an awful lot of risk in the system, billions and billions of dollars worth of risk globally. And so the industry has implemented a number of technologies to try to reduce risk even further. The U.S. has recently shifted to chip cards. Well, chip cards are, I won't say impossible to clone, but they're nearly impossible to clone, certainly very difficult to clone given access to resources that the criminal underground would like to have access to. And so the counterfeit problem with physical cards has been significantly reduced. And that's a great thing. But as with the other chip migrations, we see more fraud migrating to the web, and so a number of other technologies are being put in place to try to reduce that as well. And the two that we'll talk a little bit about are tokens, tokenization. It's what we've got these game tokens here, and 3D Secure 2, which has is about to really change the face of e-commerce in Europe. Does anybody remember these things? Yeah, you got Chuck E. Cheese, right? My wife worked at Chuck E. Cheese, and so anytime I talk about tokens, I think about my wife, and she was dancing around in the rat costume, and I think I still have some tokens from Chuck E. Cheese.
You're in New York. We use them for transportation.
Exactly. There you go. Up until open loop systems, right? So tokens, are just a way to transfer, something of higher value to something that has, value in a limited context. Casino chips is the other one that I talk about a lot. So tokenization of card data is a way for, issuers to reduce their risk by not letting valuable information, valuable static data be proliferated in the ecosystem. So let me shift a little bit now, moving away from kind of security aspects and talk about translucence. Now, there was a piece in Wired several years ago. I think Jack Dorsey kind of was the target of this this interview in Wired, and he talked about transparent payments, where you'll simply walk into a shop and you'll pick some stuff up and you'll just walk out. And while I think that's generally a good direction for the industry, that user experience, the desires of the consumer are considered there, and that's a good thing. There's a bit of friction that you want in the system, though. I sometimes tell this story about Gatorade Who uses the dash buttons in Amazon? I love the dash buttons. Anybody? Well, they have virtual dash buttons as well. If you go onto the, yeah, you just hit the button, and stuff just shows up. Right? We're like rats. We just, hit the button and get our pellets. But this woman, there's an article, I think it was in the journal, I can't remember exactly, but she had a dash button for Gatorade. For kids love Gatorade, and so they would hit the dash button, the Gatorade would show up, and it was great. And then one day the price changed, and somebody hit the Gatorade dash button, and the Gatorade showed up, and it was a lot more expensive than it was the last time. And this was a little bit strange for this mom. She's kind of watching her household budget, and this was taking a pretty big chunk of their e-commerce spend, sort of unexpectedly. And so there's a bit of friction that you do want, right? When the consumer is entering this interaction, you want to at least present them with the minimum amount of information that says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And this is the price. This is what you're committed to. And if you don't have that component there where the consumer understands what they're signing up for, then that ultimately leads to a bad interaction further down the road. It might be okay right at the moment, right? But when the consequences of that kind of hit reality, then the interaction is not as good. And so I talk about this with my team all the time. We want to inject just enough information into the process to allow the consumer to have a really good experience, but to still have a little bit of that acknowledgement of price or conditions or whatever in order to check out. And that becomes really important, and I'll talk about extended reality here in a second. That becomes really important in new interactions, new channels, right? Talked about technology and how that's inevitable, and removing some of the, the kind of the barriers or the problems in older interactions. Well, we're about to embark on a whole new set of interactions, new customer integrations that exist, and we talk about the web and all of that, and that's great. But what about IoT? What about augmented reality? What about virtual reality scenarios? And it's not science fiction, right? We have customers today where we're working with right now to integrate payments into their AR and VR experiences. And they don't want to break the experience, right? You've got the goggles on, or you've got the glasses on, and you're doing something. You don't want to sort of take the consumer out of that experience where they have to take some physical piece of hardware out and pull their wallet out and do something with it, and then put the thing back on, and it really breaks the experience. And so you want to have interactions that are really useful and positive to the consumer. And so skeuomorphism. Does anybody know this word, skeuomorphism? We did a demonstration where we performed a virtual reality transaction where inside virtual, kind of the virtual space, we built a virtual card terminal, and there was a card that you could pick up with the virtual sort of stuff, and then you could tap the card on the virtual terminal in the virtual space, and it ran a real EMV style card transaction, chip transaction. It was the first EMV compliant chip transaction in the ecosystem. Well, that's great, but that's kind of lame because I have these goggles on, and I've got this controller, and I've got a terminal, and I've got a card. Well, that might be easy for the consumer to understand, in this kind of this skeuomorphic way, but I'm picking up a virtual card that didn't really exist in the first place, and I'm tapping on a terminal that doesn't really exist either. Why am I doing that, right? And so skeuomorphism starts to kind of fade away, and so what we're doing right now is taking some of the learnings from those old skeuomorphic interactions and doing something where we actually process the transaction using the web payments form, and building something that is compliant with the W3C standard in virtual reality, in augmented reality, which will enable a new set of commerce interactions for consumers, which will be hopefully a lot of fun. Coming back to identity, though, augmented or extended or whatever set of sort of reality you live in, identity is still becoming more and more critical, tying the virtual tying the digital components of your identity to your physical, your real components of your identity. And as these two things become closer and closer, the assurance level for a particular interaction becomes higher. And that assurance level, once it gets to a certain point, then everybody's comfortable. If that assurance level is too low, then issuers aren't comfortable, merchants aren't comfortable, networks aren't comfortable, thinking about kind of normal card interactions, and those transactions won't get approved, right? And consumers are unhappy. You have new sort of payment methods. I wouldn't say new, but different payment methods to what most people in the room are probably familiar with. Ally and WeChat type payment interactions. Ideal in the Nordics, or not Nordics, but in Amsterdam and surrounding regions there. These sorts of interactions have a different kind of flow, and they're really highly tied to the identity of the consumer and their banking identity and banking credentials. And so, these sorts of things are going to continue to be really important. I promised that I would talk a little bit about open banking. And so I put this on here. Open banking is just a component of PSD2. There's two components, SCA, as well as access to access to account. And so you look at these two things as they kind of converge in the European space, and it won't be long before we see this type of activity happen all over the place. How many? Who knows what PSD2 is? Okay, so we got pretty good covering there, right? So strong customer authentication, right, is SCA, access to account. So you have open banking on one side, allowing lots of API interactions to get to information, and then on the other side you have a strong customer authentication component, which allows you to have assurance around payment interactions. These two things combined are going to really have a significant impact to developments, especially in Europe. And I think that we'll start to see some of that trickle out outside of Europe as well, certainly because SCA is going to be heavily reliant on something like 3D Secure. And so you're going to see more 3D Secure activity happen across e-commerce interactions. So it'll be really interesting. I'm kind of, as a person that lives in Europe, I'm a little bit concerned and excited at the same time, because I don't want to get stepped up every time. How many of you guys get stepped up in authentication anymore? Like in the U.S., it doesn't happen very often, right? There's just like no web authentication for most transactions for U.S. cardholders. But in Europe, my issuer likes to do step-up authentication a lot. And I call them, and they're not the greatest, and I tell them, look, your 3D Secure implementation is not good. You do this, and this. It's hard. It doesn't work, right? Have you ever tried to explain to like a customer support representative as a payments insider, like what's going on? And it's disaster, right? It's a disaster. I had to tell somebody today that my payment for my rent showed up on a Monday instead of a Saturday, because the Bank of England doesn't settle money on Saturdays. And they were like, huh, what? But thinking about customer authentication, and then moving on to the Internet of Things, how does a robot validate the identity of a consumer? Have you seen these little guys running around? I think that it's not going to be long before we start to see them, certainly in San Francisco and probably New York as well. San Francisco now, you see the bikes just like littered on the ground, right, and the scooters and things. So I think pretty soon we'll see the robots, and people kick them off the road, and people try to bang them open and steal Amazon packages and things like that. I think it'd be really interesting to see what kind of defense mechanisms people build into these things. But at the end of kind of that last mile, right? If you think that UPS or Amazon or FedEx isn't thinking about this, you'd be wrong, right? We're working with folks like that right now on how to integrate identity and authentication systems into these last mile delivery mechanisms, and it's going to be a really exciting time because you've got a whole new set of interactions. Again, you're not changing the customer desires, you're not changing what they want, you're not changing what the merchant wants, but the channel, the mechanism, the scope, the scale is changing. And that's going to be really exciting. Last thing for me, thinking about how the interactions that you do, play with in the payment space and the financial technology space. And I was just talking with somebody, Mr. Benoit there in the back a few minutes ago, thinking about, well, how should it be, right? Not thinking about how it is today and how to bolt on, security, or how to bolt on authentication, or how to bolt on identity, but how should an interaction be, right? And the payments piece is really, really inconsequential if you start to think about, all of the interactions that need to happen, right? Validating that identity, authenticating, building a level of assurance, that's the real important piece. And so, thinking about how, how disruptors, and I don't usually like to use this word disruptor, but, how new entrants are looking at this system, right? They're building systems because they don't have the benefit or the drawback of legacy, right? And so they don't have any scale, but at the same time, they don't have any of the drawbacks of legacy. And so think about in your own sort of environments when you're building these new sets of systems, new APIs, new interactions, how can you take advantage of that new thinking and say, what does the customer want? And then drive back to that, because ultimately that's what's going to win in the end. So I think I've got, I'm over. I'm over time. I tried to time it, really close, but thank you so much for your time.
Right?
There you go.
I'm timing myself too.
Right.
So a few questions maybe from the audience. Will you have any questions for Marc? Yes.
Could you go into how Worldpay plans on interacting with the currencies that are non-governmental that are developing and proliferating around the world, these cyber currencies?
So like the Bitcoins or Ethereum or whatever?
Yeah.
So, yeah, good question. I think we've done a lot of experimentation, let's say, around crypto and digital currencies. From my perspective, the currency piece is really, it's not all that interesting because I don't care, like dollars or yen or pounds or whatever, it's already a digital currency. In the e-commerce space, like when does a piece of, what does a piece of paper actually change hands, right? It doesn't. So I think, paying in Bitcoin or paying in Ethereum, or paying it really in any digital currency is kind of, it's kind of risky, to be honest, right? Because if I'm a holder of Bitcoin and I go to Starbucks and I want to pay with Bitcoin, I'm exposing myself to quite a lot of kind of currency fluctuation. So I'm not sure that from a consumer perspective it's really all that interesting. And I get all the arguments around anonymity and all that, but actually, I met a company last time I was here in New York, and anonymity around digital currency is kind of a myth. It's not anonymous, really. But I think that what is interesting around cryptocurrencies is the ledger technology. It enables some really interesting interactions. At the end of the day, it's a ledger, though, right? So if you have a need for a ledger in your existing business, then you can implement a digital ledger, a shared ledger, an open ledger, whatever you want to call it, and you might have some really interesting interactions. And that's where we're playing right now. Shared escrow systems, delayed escrow systems. Those are quite interesting. But I think it's inevitable that those sorts of systems will replace legacy sort of ledger systems. But I'm just not sure that transacting in a Bitcoin or whatever is all that interesting right now.
Any other
question? It's maybe a little unfair, but can you comment around open banking here in the States seems a decent ways behind Europe. And why? And sort of
I mean, really, banks specifically open banking is almost like a brand name of X2A, right? So open banking is just kind of the UK's branded version of access to account. Now, and that's a European specific set of regulations. Now, I think that it's very interesting. The UK seems to be far ahead of the U.S. as far as what I call the sort of challenger bank movement, Monzo and Starling and and N26, although they're kind of not in the UK, but have a pretty good presence there. Revolut and others. They really have done quite a lot in the UK market. Why that stuff hasn't sort of taken off in the U.S., I don't know. It's sort of strange. Marcus is the Goldman brand, right? And Marcus has a pretty good product set. Props out to the Marcus group because they're the ones that are in the background on the Apple Card stuff, which is kind of interesting. It's like interesting in its boringness. I think the U.S. is probably a little bit harder to sort of navigate the regulatory waters because you don't have just one regime. You've got 50, plus more. And so, if I'm a startup in that space, I don't have any experience in the U.S. space. There isn't any sort of common frameworks around APIs or interactions between financial institutions. I think the U.S. is just not really all that interesting to go after because it would just take the technology investment to get to a certain point to scale would be quite hard because you've got to build 50 regulatory kind of regimes to handle all the 50 states. You have to have charters in multiple states. All those sorts of things would be quite difficult. Doesn't mean it's impossible. I think companies like Goldman certainly have the pockets to do those sorts of things. But I think it's, in this case, regulatory initiative in Europe spurred innovation, and there isn't the same sort of environment in the U.S.
Okay, Beth?
Yeah, so you mentioned PSD2 earlier, so kind of as a bellwether for kind of enabling innovation. What do you think went right with that? And where do you think, like, if you were designing it, what would you do differently?
So I think, having spent time with regulators, PSD2, I think its heart is in the right place, right? But as with most kind of regulation, it gets, 60, 70, 80%, let's say, of the use cases. And then there's that last bit that, is too new or kind of too edge case where it just doesn't fit right. And all of a sudden, it sort of broke a bunch of stuff. The great example is merchant-initiated transactions, right? Card-on-file interactions, things like that, where originally, if you kind of took a really strict reading of the regulations, it would say that you had to authenticate every transaction that was performed online. Well, how does that happen when the consumer isn't actually initiating the transaction, right? Subscription services and those sorts of things, and so it took quite a long time to get clarity around those kinds of interactions. And I think that because the models that we're seeing emerge are just happening so quickly that this sort of the strict adherence to the standards, strict adherence to the law is difficult, and regulators, just because there isn't 50 states in Europe doesn't mean that there aren't 20 whatever countries, right? Germany is different than France, is different than the Netherlands, is different than whatever, and they all have sort of slightly different perspectives as well, which is kind of difficult to manage. So I don't know, from a regulatory perspective in the U.S., I think there's interesting activity around things like faster payments. Will the Fed step in here? Will they not step in? Will they actually run a system, build a system, or will they cede that to, the likes of the big banks? The big banks have already built something. They already have a set of APIs. They already have some activity there. So I think, what would I do differently? I think allow some leeway for the players in the ecosystem to have a more risk-based approach. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what they wanted, right? Was to reduce fraud, and reducing risk is desirable. And so why not allow the players in that space to take some responsibility for the risk that is in the system? Because I have some merchants right today that would be like, I don't care, I'll just pay the consumer back. I'll take all the risk. I want I want it all. And if there's a problem, then I'll just help the consumer out on the backside. And regulators don't see it that way, right? They're out to protect the consumer, which is great. But maybe that's not always the best scenario.
Mike, you have a question? Yeah.
Switched on?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Mike Massar. Marc, I'd just be interested in your perspective on innovation around the world. If I look at what's happening in the US and Europe, lots of the innovation is around our existing pipes. Even Apple Pay uses existing pipes, 3D Secure you mentioned, etc. But you look at China, you look at Africa, you look at India's kind of a halfway house. A lot of those other continents are really bypassing the old legacy pipes and coming up with completely new payment systems. I don't know the answer to this, but I'm interested in your perspective. Do you think that at some point in time the Western world will move to a new generation of pipes?
Yeah, good question. I look at what I think of as digital foundations, and so if you look at some place like London, the physical existence of London, the foundations of London were set, by a couple of very significant events, right? One was the London fire, and two was the bombing, during the Blitz. So, the physical characteristics of London were shaped by those scenarios, and so you have infrastructure that is set up in the UK within the M25 that is more advanced in some ways and less advanced in others. And the rail system is a perfect example where you have, some like, Southern and Western Rail, they didn't relay tracks, after World War II, and so they still have, really bad track infrastructure. Whereas, some of the others, Northern and, some of those have new track infrastructure. And so the infrastructure that, we see today for payments, especially in the e-commerce space, that stuff was laid, right? Alan put Tim Berners-Lee's face on here, right? That stuff was laid out decades ago. And so, if you think about, China or Africa or South Asia, and you think about the new foundation elements, right? The new components that are laying the digital foundation of those systems today, those aren't they weren't laid decades ago. They're laid now, right? Using the components that exist today. So if Facebook or Amazon or AWS, right, is a new component, a new piece of infrastructure, what are the possibilities for that economy, that system, where you're using a really advanced set of infrastructure to lay that foundation versus something from decades ago. And so I think in the West, where we've had the benefit of the web, and that we are sort of lagging because the web itself is lagging, right? And not because of the standards, not because of the efforts of anybody, but because some of the foundational layers are aged, and so inevitably somebody will have to sort of relay that foundation. But I think it's going to take a lot of time. I really like the emerging payment systems in Africa and Pesa. I really love WeChat Pay. I had to hack my phone significantly, so when I go to China, I can use WeChat Pay. But it's great. You just WeChat, and it's perfect. But you know, it's just a different sort of interaction. I think that we're going to see more fragmentation before we see more consolidation. And we'll see more of these sort of systems pop up. You know, and you can just see where they're going to pop up. They're going to pop up in Africa. They're going to pop up in South Asia. They're going to pop up in, you know, India, because that's where we're laying new foundation. They're not going to pop up in the U.S. They're not going to pop up in Western Europe, because they have ubiquitous systems that are okay, you know, good enough, right? How many times in the technology space, you know, do people settle for good enough? Quite often. And so good enough lasts for quite a while.
Okay, thank you, Marc.